You think you can just sit there wearing that hat and nobody's going to say anything? Mia snapped, her voice cutting through the tranquil hum of the Maplewood Library courtyard. The afternoon sun glared off the bold red letters, "Make America Great Again," embroidered on the cap perched on the elderly man's head. Mr. Jameson, seated on the wooden bench with a book resting in his lap, looked up slowly. His kind blue eyes met Mia's fiery gaze. "It's just a hat," he said softly, his voice calm but firm. "Nothing more. Just a hat," Mia scoffed, her fists clenching at her sides. Her friends Amber and Jay flanked her, exchanging smirks as they encouraged her with silent nods. "That thing stands for everything that's wrong with this world. You should be ashamed to wear it." Mr. Jameson sighed, closing his book with deliberate care. "Young lady, I'm not here to argue, I'm just reading." But Mia wasn't about to let it go. The emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface, years of resentment, anger, and unspoken pain, erupted. She snatched the hat off his head, holding it up like a trophy. "Maybe you should find another symbol to cling to." The man didn't flinch. He didn't yell or grab for the hat. Instead, he sat back, watching her with a gaze that was almost sad. "If you think taking it will change what it means to me," he said quietly, "then you don't understand it at all." The tension was palpable, thick enough to choke, and just as Mia prepared to fire back, a small, trembling voice broke through the chaos. "Why are you doing this to Mr. J?" Mia turned sharply to see a little girl, no older than 8, clutching a worn paperback book to her chest. Her wide, tear-filled eyes stared at Mia like she was the villain in a story the girl couldn't understand. And then, from the library steps, came a voice of authority that made everyone freeze. "Mia Parker. My office. Now." Principal Davis's booming command cut through the tension like a whip, leaving silence in its wake. Just when you think things can't escalate further, the past collides with the present, forcing Mia to confront not only the consequences of her actions, but the deep-rooted pain that drove her here. What is the story behind the hat and the man who wears it? Thank you for listening to the start of this thought-provoking story. If you're already hooked and excited to see what happens next, comment 2 below. If you think Mia might have gone too far, or if you have your own thoughts on how this story could unfold, comment 7. And don't forget to subscribe to Elderly Wisdom for more stories that challenge your perspective, touch your heart, and inspire meaningful conversations. Let's keep the discussion going. As the door to Principal Davis's office closed with a decisive click, Mia sank into one of the chairs across from his desk, her heart pounding. Amber and Jay were seated on either side of her, their usual smirks wiped clean. The weight of the moment pressed down on them like a storm cloud ready to burst. Principal Davis sat down slowly, folding his hands on the desk. His piercing gaze swept across the trio. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice low but steady. "What you did today was not just disrespectful, it was cruel. Do you even know who Mr. Jameson is?" Mia stared down at her hands, but the principal wasn't going to let her off that easily. "He's a retired teacher, a Vietnam veteran, and he volunteers every week at the library to help children learn to read." Davis's voice grew sharper. "He's given more to this community than any of you can imagine, and today you decided to humiliate him. Over a hat." Mia's stomach churned. The principal's words cut deeper than she had expected. She hadn't known any of that. To her, the man had been nothing more than a walking symbol of everything she despised. "Principal Davis, we didn't mean to," Amber began, but he cut her off with a raised hand. "Don't," he said firmly. "Don't try to excuse it. You may think you were making some kind of statement, but all you did was show how little you understand about respect, empathy, and the impact of your actions." Mia glanced sideways at her friends. Jay was staring at the floor, and Amber's face was flushed. For once, none of them had anything to say. Davis leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Mia's. "Here's how this is going to work. You're suspended for 1 week, but that's not the end of it." Starting next Monday, the three of you will report to the library every afternoon for a month. You'll be assisting Mr. Jameson with his volunteer work. Whatever he asks, you do it. Consider it your chance to make amends." Amber let out a soft groan, and Jay's head snapped up. "A month?" he protested, but Davis's glare silenced him. "As long as you're students at this school, you'll learn what it means to be part of a community," the principal said. "And part of that means owning your mistakes and learning from them. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, sir," Mia muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Her friends echoed her reluctantly. As they left the office, the hallway felt impossibly long. Amber broke the silence first. "This is ridiculous. We didn't even do anything that bad." Mia stopped in her tracks, turning to face her. "Didn't do anything that bad? We humiliated a man in front of a child, a man who's done nothing wrong." Her voice cracked slightly, surprising even herself. Amber and Jay stared at her, but neither said a word. For the first time, Mia felt the full weight of what had happened. The image of Mr. Jameson's sad, steady gaze and the little girl's trembling voice replayed in her mind like a broken record. As they walked home, Mia knew this wasn't just about the suspension or the community service. It was about something bigger. She had to face not only what she had done, but why she had done it. What was it about that hat and everything it represented that made her so angry? And, more importantly, what would she do now to make things right? Mia stood outside the Maplewood Library, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. She could feel her friend's unease behind her, but neither Amber nor Jay said anything as they shuffled nervously. The usually warm and inviting entrance now felt like the gateway to her own reckoning. "I can't believe we have to spend a whole month here," Amber muttered under her breath. Mia ignored her, her heart hammering in her chest. As the automatic doors slid open, a rush of cool air hit her face, carrying the faint smell of old books and polished wood. She stepped inside, and there he was, Mr. Jameson. He stood by a tall cart of books, quietly organizing them onto the shelves. His red MAGA hat rested on the corner of the cart, almost like a silent reminder of everything that had brought her here. For a brief moment, she considered turning around and walking right back out. But before she could act on the impulse, he looked up and spotted her. His calm blue eyes met hers, and a small, polite smile tugged at his lips. "Ah, Mia, isn't it?" he said, his tone cordial. "And your friends? I heard you'd be joining me this month." Mia felt her face flush. She nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." "Well, let's not waste any time," Mr. Jameson said, motioning to the cart. "I could use a hand shelving these. Fiction's to the right, alphabetized, and the children's section is in the back corner. Amber, Jay, you can help there." Amber let out a soft sigh, but followed Jay toward the children's section without protest. Mia stayed behind, silently taking a few books from the cart. She avoided looking directly at him, the tension in the air feeling almost unbearable. "I don't bite, you know," Mr. Jameson said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice carried a trace of humor, but his gaze was gentle. "No need to tiptoe around me." Mia felt a flicker of shame. "I'm not tiptoeing," she mumbled. He chuckled softly. "Good. Then let's get started." As the minutes turned into an hour, Mia found herself glancing at him as he worked. There was something unassuming about the way he moved, methodical, patient, as if the chaos of the world outside didn't touch him here. She noticed how the children in the library greeted him, their faces lighting up as they ran over to show him their chosen books. He knelt to their level, speaking to them with an ease and warmth that caught Mia off guard. Why had she assumed the worst about him? Halfway through the afternoon, Mia overheard a conversation between Mr. Jameson and Emma, the little girl who had confronted her during the incident. She peeked around the corner, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Mr. J, why do you wear that hat all the time?" Emma asked, her small hands fidgeting with a bookmark. Mr. Jameson paused, the book in his hands momentarily forgotten. "Well, Emma," he said slowly, This hat reminds me of my son. He gave it to me before he deployed overseas. It was the last gift I got from him before he didn't come home. Mia felt her chest tighten. She stepped back, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. It wasn't just a hat to him. It wasn't about politics or division. It was about loss, memory, and love. As she returned to shelving books, her mind raced. For the first time, she wondered if all her assumptions about Mr. Jameson had been wrong. Maybe this wasn't about him at all. Maybe it was about her own anger, her own unresolved pain. She thought about the last time she had seen her father, his own MAGA hat hanging on the edge of his suitcase as he left. The argument that had driven him away hadn't been about the hat itself. It had been about feeling abandoned, unheard, left behind. Later that day, as the library emptied out, Mr. Jameson approached Mia. She stiffened, expecting a lecture, but instead, he handed her a small, worn book. "I thought you might like this," he said simply. "It's a story about finding common ground. Figured it might resonate." Mia took the book, staring down at its cover. The title, more than it seemed to mock her. She looked up at him, unsure of what to say. "Thank you," she managed. He nodded, his expression kind. "You're welcome. See you tomorrow, Mia." As she walked out of the library with Amber and Jay trailing behind, the book felt heavier in her hands than it should have. For the first time, she didn't feel anger or resentment toward Mr. Jameson. She felt something else entirely, regret, and maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding. The second day at the library felt different. Mia arrived earlier than her friends, clutching the book Mr. Jameson had given her the day before. She hadn't opened it yet, but it had stayed on her nightstand, a quiet presence that wouldn't let her ignore it. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of old pages and the murmur of quiet conversations greeted her. Mr. Jameson was already there, setting up a reading circle for the children. His red hat rested casually on the corner of the table, as though it belonged there as much as he did. Mia hesitated, unsure if she should approach him. Before she could decide, Emma appeared at her side, clutching a picture book tightly to her chest. "Are you here to help Mr. J again?" she asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Mia nodded, her voice soft. "Yeah, I am." Emma tilted her head, studying her with the unfiltered honesty only children have. "You were mean to him before, but Mr. J said you might be nice now." The simple statement hit harder than Mia expected. "I'm trying to be," she admitted, more to herself than to Emma. Emma smiled and pointed toward the reading circle. "You can sit with us if you want. Mr. J is reading The Giving Tree. It's my favorite." Mia followed the little girl, taking a seat near the edge of the group. Mr. Jameson's voice was steady and warm as he read aloud, his tone carrying the weight of someone who truly loved the story. As the tale of selflessness and love unfolded, Mia found herself drawn in, the words echoing in her chest. By the end, she felt an unexpected lump in her throat. When the children dispersed, Mr. Jameson turned to her, his expression kind but unreadable. "The Giving Tree," he said, holding up the book. "It's simple, but it always seems to stick with people." Mia nodded, unsure of what to say. Finally, she blurted, "Mr. Jameson, I didn't know about your son, about the hat. I'm sorry." His face softened, but he didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, he let her sit with her words, let her feel them fully. "Thank you," he said at last. "That means more than you know." Mia hesitated, then added, "I lost my dad. Not like you lost your son, but he left. We fought about that hat, and I guess I blamed him. And when I saw you wearing it, it was like seeing him all over again." Mr. Jameson finished gently. Mia nodded, her throat tight. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You know, anger's a funny thing. It feels like it's protecting us, but all it really does is build walls. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't letting it go, it's figuring out what it's hiding." His words settled over her like a heavy blanket, warm but suffocating in their truth. She hadn't just been angry at her dad. She'd been angry at herself for not knowing how to stop him from leaving, angry at the world for making her feel powerless. "Maybe those walls aren't as strong as I thought," Mia admitted quietly. Mr. Jameson smiled, a small but genuine expression. "That's a good start." As Mia begins to uncover the layers of her own anger, a surprising act of kindness from Mr. Jameson will challenge her even further. But just as she's starting to grow, her friends, Amber and Jay, may not be ready to follow the same path. What happens when old habits clash with newfound understanding? Don't miss the next chapter of this powerful story. By the 6th day, the rhythm of the library felt almost normal to Mia. She had grown used to the quiet murmur of children's laughter, the subtle rustle of pages turning, and Mr. Jameson's steady presence. But today, tension brewed beneath the surface. Amber and Jay had arrived late, and they were in no mood for shelving books or helping with the reading circle. "This is pointless," Amber whispered to Jay as they lingered near the cart of books, clearly avoiding their duties. "We've already been here almost a week. What's one old man going to teach us?" Mia overheard them but said nothing. Instead, she focused on reorganizing the children's section, determined to stay out of their drama. But when Amber's voice rose just slightly, her words struck a nerve. "Look at Mia," Amber scoffed. "Acting like she's some kind of saint now. What happened to the girl who wanted to rip that hat off his head?" Mia froze, her hands tightening around the spine of a book. She glanced toward Mr. Jameson, who was seated nearby with Emma, oblivious to the rising tension. Her chest tightened as she realized she had to make a choice: stay silent and let her friends drag her back into old habits, or speak up. She stood and turned toward them, her voice steady but firm. "I've changed, Amber. Maybe you should try it too." Jay laughed under his breath, but Amber's eyes narrowed. "Oh, so now you're better than us? Is that it?" "It's not about being better," Mia said, stepping closer. "It's about realizing that we were wrong, all of us. What we did to him was cruel, and it had nothing to do with him. It was about us, our anger, our insecurities. If you can't see that, maybe you're the one with the problem." Amber opened her mouth to retort, but before she could, Mr. Jameson's voice cut through the tension. "Everything okay over there?" he asked, his calm gaze shifting between them. Mia hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, everything's fine." Amber rolled her eyes and stormed off toward the break area, Jay following close behind. Mia stood there, her heart pounding, but she felt something new: pride. She had chosen to stand her ground, to defend not just Mr. Jameson, but the person she was trying to become. Later, as she helped Mr. Jameson tidy up the reading circle, he gave her a knowing smile. "Standing up for what's right isn't always easy," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But it's worth it." Mia nodded, her throat tight. I don't know if they'll ever get it." "They might," he replied, stacking the books with practiced ease. "Or they might not. What matters is that you do." As the day wound down, Mia found herself sitting beside Mr. Jameson at the front desk, helping him sort through a stack of returned books. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace, like she was finally beginning to let go of the anger that had weighed her down for so long. And yet, as the library emptied and the sun dipped lower in the sky, she couldn't shake the feeling that Amber and Jay's resistance wasn't over. She would have to face them again, and the next time it might not end as easily. The tension between Mia, Amber, and Jay lingered like a storm cloud the following day. Amber, still fuming from the confrontation, barely spoke to Mia, and Jay seemed caught in the middle, unsure which side to take. Mia, for her part, was determined not to let their bitterness derail her progress, but the crack in their friendship was undeniable. By mid-afternoon, the library was bustling with children eager for story time. Mia had thrown herself into helping Mr. Jameson set up the reading circle, carefully arranging cushions and stacking books for the kids to choose from. As she worked, she caught Amber and Jay lounging in the corner, scrolling through their phones instead of pitching in. Her patience wore thin. She approached them, her voice firm but quiet. "Are you seriously just going to sit there all day?" Amber looked up, her expression defiant. Why not? You're doing enough brown-nosing for all of us. Mia's fists clenched, but she took a deep breath. This isn't about him, she said, gesturing toward Mr. Jameson, who was chatting with a group of parents nearby. It's about us. Don't you get it? We have a chance to actually do something good here, instead of just making everything worse. Amber smirked, leaning back in her chair. Good for you, Mia. But not everyone's looking to play hero. Jay shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting between the two girls. Maybe we should at least help out a little, he murmured. Amber shot him a glare, and he quickly looked away. Before Mia could respond, a sudden commotion interrupted them. One of the younger kids had tripped near the shelves, sending a stack of books tumbling to the floor. Mr. Jameson hurried over, helping the boy to his feet while Mia instinctively moved to pick up the scattered books. Amber and Jay remained rooted in their seats, watching the scene with disinterest. As Mia crouched to gather the books, she heard the boy sniffle. I didn't mean to make a mess, he mumbled, his small hands trembling. It's okay, Mia said gently, handing him one of the fallen books. Accidents happen. Mr. Jameson knelt beside them, his hand resting lightly on the boy's shoulder. Mia's right, he said with a kind smile. The important thing is that you're not hurt. Want to help us put these back? The boy nodded hesitantly, his tearful expression brightening as he joined Mia in stacking the books. Watching the interaction, Mia felt a flicker of pride. This was the kind of moment that mattered. Small acts of kindness that could make all the difference. But as she glanced back at Amber and Jay, her resolve wavered. Amber's eyes were narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line, while Jay looked increasingly uncomfortable. It was clear that Amber's resentment wasn't just about Mr. Jameson anymore. It was about Mia herself. That evening, as they walked home, Amber finally let her frustration spill over. You think you're better than us now, don't you? She snapped, breaking the uneasy silence. Mia stopped in her tracks, turning to face her. No, Amber, I don't think I'm better. I think I've been worse, and I'm trying to fix it. Amber scoffed. Fix it? By what? Playing the perfect little volunteer for some old man? You think that erases everything? It's not about erasing it, Mia said, her voice steady. It's about learning from it. I don't want to be the person I was that day. Don't you? Amber's jaw tightened, but she didn't reply. Instead, she turned and walked ahead, leaving Mia and Jay trailing behind. Jay hesitated, then spoke quietly. She'll come around. She just needs time. Mia nodded, though doubt gnawed at her. I hope so. The next day at the library, things took an unexpected turn. As Mia helped Mr. Jameson sort through a box of new arrivals, Amber walked in late, her expression unreadable. She made her way to the front desk and stood there for a moment before finally speaking. What do you need me to do? She asked, her voice clipped. Mr. Jameson looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Well, the children's section could use some organizing, he said, gesturing toward the shelves. Amber nodded stiffly and headed toward the back of the library. Jay, clearly relieved, followed her, leaving Mia and Mr. Jameson alone. Small steps, Mr. Jameson said with a knowing smile. Sometimes that's all it takes. By the time Mia reached the library the next day, the tension between her and Amber felt insurmountable. Amber hadn't spoken to her since the blow-up, and Jay, caught between his loyalty to both girls, had avoided the topic altogether. As Mia walked through the familiar library doors, the scent of old books and polished wood seemed heavier than usual, a weight pressing on her chest. Mr. Jameson greeted her with his usual warm smile, but Mia could sense his quiet concern. Morning, Mia. Ready for another day? He asked, his tone deliberately light. She nodded, forcing a smile. Yeah, let's do it. As the hours passed, Mia threw herself into the work, shelving books and helping with the reading circle. Amber, who arrived late, barely acknowledged her presence. Jay followed Amber's lead, staying close to her and away from Mia, though his discomfort was evident. It all came to a head later that afternoon. The library was quieter than usual, with only a handful of children lingering in the reading circle. Mr. Jameson had stepped out to take a phone call, leaving the teens alone to manage the space. That's when Amber made her move. "I'm done with this," Amber muttered, shoving the cart of unshelved books aside. "This whole thing is pointless." Mia straightened from where she was organizing a shelf, her heart sinking. "Amber, can we not do this right now?" "Do what?" Amber snapped, turning to face her. "Point out that you've been acting like some self-righteous martyr since day one. You're not fooling anyone, Mia. You're just trying to make yourself feel better." The words hit Mia like a slap. She stared at Amber, struggling to keep her composure. "That's not fair," she said quietly. "I'm trying to make things right. For all of us." "For all of us?" Amber laughed bitterly. "Don't act like this is about us. It's about you. You don't care about anyone but yourself." Jay shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between them. "Guys, maybe we should just—" "No," Mia cut him off, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and hurt. "You're right, Amber. I do want to feel better. But not for the reason you think. I hate what we did to Mr. Jameson, and I hate that we're still pretending it wasn't that bad. It was. And if you can't see that, maybe you're the one who doesn't care." Amber's face flushed with fury. "You think you're so much better than me now? You're just as messed up as the rest of us. Don't pretend like you've got it all figured out." Mia's chest tightened, her frustration boiling over. "I don't have it all figured out, Amber, but at least I'm trying. What are you doing? Sitting in the corner and complaining while everyone else does the work? That's not who we used to be." Amber's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her voice remained sharp. "Maybe you're not who I thought you were either." The silence that followed was deafening. Amber grabbed her bag and stormed out, slamming the library door behind her. Jay hesitated, torn between following Amber and staying with Mia. "You should go," Mia said softly, turning back to the shelf she'd been organizing. "She needs you." Jay opened his mouth to speak but thought better of it. With a reluctant sigh, he left, leaving Mia alone in the suddenly vast, empty library. Later that evening, Mr. Jameson found her sitting near the front desk, staring blankly at the book he'd lent her days ago. Without a word, he pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "Rough day?" he asked gently. Mia nodded, her throat tight. Amber left. "And Jay? I think I've lost them both." Mr. Jameson was quiet for a moment, then said, "Losing people hurts, especially when it feels like you've grown apart. But sometimes those breaks are what let us grow into who we're meant to be." Mia looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if they never come back?" He smiled faintly. "Then you'll still be here, stronger, wiser, and better for having tried." For the first time that day, Mia felt a flicker of hope. She didn't know what the future held for her friendships, but she knew she couldn't go back to the person she was before. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The tension that had been simmering for weeks finally reached its peak the following day. Mia arrived at the library early, hoping to find some peace in the quiet before Amber and Jay showed up. The place had become a strange refuge for her, a space where she could reflect, grow, and feel something close to purpose. But today, even the familiar scent of old books and the comforting hum of activity couldn't ease the knot in her stomach. By mid-morning, Amber and Jay arrived together. Amber's eyes were still red-rimmed from the previous day, but her expression was as guarded as ever. Jay looked like he hadn't slept, his shoulders slumped under the weight of being caught between his two closest friends. Mia avoided looking at them as she helped Mr. Jameson prepare for the library's weekly Book Buddies event, where children were paired with volunteers to practice reading. She didn't trust herself to say anything yet, not while the sting of Amber's words still lingered. As the event began, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, at least temporarily. Mia was paired with a shy little girl named Sophie, who struggled with reading but lit up every time Mia encouraged her. Amber and Jay were assigned to different groups, and for a while it seemed like they were all too busy to let their conflicts spill over. But the peace didn't last. Near the end of the session, a commotion erupted near the children's section. Sophie, trying to reach a book on a high shelf, had accidentally knocked over a stack of books. The loud crash startled her, and she burst into tears, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Mia rushed to her side, crouching down to comfort the girl. "It's okay, Sophie," she said softly. "It's just books. No big deal." Amber, who had been nearby, sighed loudly. Maybe if someone was paying attention instead of playing Saint of the Week, this wouldn't have happened. Mia's patience snapped. She stood, facing Amber with a calm she didn't entirely feel. "What is your problem, Amber? I'm trying to help her." "Why do you care so much about what I do?" Amber's eyes flashed with anger. "Because you're pretending you're better than us. Like you're the only one who cares about fixing things." "That's not true," Mia shot back. "I'm not pretending anything. I've made mistakes, so have you. But at least I'm trying to do better." The argument drew the attention of everyone nearby, including Mr. Jameson. He approached slowly, his presence enough to quiet the room. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Amber looked away, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Jay shuffled uncomfortably, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. Mia felt her face flush with embarrassment, but forced herself to speak. "We're just working some things out," she said, her voice subdued. Mr. Jameson studied them for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe it's time we talked about what's really going on," he said. He gestured toward the back of the library, away from the children. "Come with me." In the quiet corner of the library, Mr. Jameson sat them down, his gaze steady but kind. "I've seen a lot of people in my life," he began. "People who've carried anger, pain, regret. It eats away at them, makes them push away the very people who might help them heal." Amber's jaw tightened, but she didn't interrupt. Jay stared at his hands, his discomfort palpable. "I don't know what's between you three," Mr. Jameson continued, "but I do know this: holding on to anger doesn't fix anything. It just builds walls, and eventually you find yourself trapped behind them." Mia swallowed hard, her mind flashing back to the walls she'd built after her father left, the ones that had made her lash out at Mr. Jameson in the first place. "I don't want to be angry anymore," she said softly, almost to herself. Mr. Jameson nodded. "Good, that's a start. But it's not enough to let go of your own anger. You have to be willing to forgive others too." The words hung heavy in the air. Mia glanced at Amber, whose expression had softened, though her defenses were still up. Jay finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to lose this," he said, gesturing vaguely between them. "Our friendship. I don't want it to end like this." Amber let out a shaky breath. "I don't either," she admitted, her voice cracking. "But it's hard, okay? I don't know how to just let go." "You don't have to do it all at once," Mr. Jameson said. "It takes time, but you have to start somewhere. And that starts with talking to each other, not at each other." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Finally, Mia turned to Amber. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice steady, "for everything, for not listening to you, for making you feel like I didn't care. I do care. A lot." Amber blinked rapidly, her composure threatening to break. "I'm sorry too," she said, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to deal with all of this." Mr. Jameson stood, giving them a small smile. "You're doing it right now," he said simply. As he walked away, leaving them to talk, Mia felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like that might just be enough. The fundraiser had been a success. Parents and children left the library with arms full of books and smiles bright enough to light the room. Mia, Amber, and Jay stood by the checkout desk, exhaustion pulling at their shoulders but pride warming their hearts. It felt like they had crossed a threshold, not just as volunteers, but as friends trying to find their way back to each other. "You know," Amber said, leaning against the counter, "this wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be." Jay smirked. "Amber Parker, giving a compliment? Somebody write this down." Amber rolled her eyes. but a small smile tugged at her lips. Mia laughed softly, grateful for the moment of levity. For the first time in weeks, things felt normal, better than normal. But just as they began tidying up, a loud crash echoed from the children's section. They turned to see Tyler, the troublemaking boy from earlier, standing amidst a pile of fallen books and a broken display stand. His mother rushed over, her face pale with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, trying to gather the scattered books while Tyler stood frozen, his face a mask of guilt and defiance. Mr. Jameson approached calmly, kneeling to help the mother. "It's all right," he said softly. "No harm done," Amber muttered under her breath. "Of course it's him again." Mia, however, moved toward Tyler, crouching down to meet his eye level. "Hey, Tyler," she said, her voice calm. "Are you okay?" The boy blinked, his bravado faltering. I didn't mean to," he mumbled. "I know," Mia said, her tone gentle but firm. "But when accidents happen, it's important to fix them. Can you help us clean this up?" Tyler hesitated, then nodded. Together they began picking up the books, and slowly the tension in the room eased. Amber watched from a distance, her arms crossed. "How does she do that?" she muttered to Jay, who shrugged. "It's called growing up," Jay said with a grin. "Maybe you should try it." Amber glared at him, but her smirk betrayed her amusement. As the last of the books were reshelved and the library quieted for the night, Mr. Jameson gathered the three teens near the front desk. His red MAGA hat sat askew on his head, a familiar sight that no longer stirred the resentment it once did. "You've all come a long way," he said, his voice steady and warm. "But before you leave, I want to share something with you." He gestured for them to sit, then pulled a photo from his pocket, a picture of a young man in military uniform, smiling brightly. "This is my son," he said, his voice softening. "He gave me this hat before he deployed. It's not about politics for me. It's about him. It's about remembering what he stood for: kindness, strength, and hope." The room was silent, the weight of his words settling over them. Mia felt a lump rise in her throat. She glanced at Amber and Jay, who both looked equally moved. "I've made mistakes in my life," Mr. Jameson continued. "We all have. But what matters is what we do afterward, how we grow, how we treat others. That's what defines us." Mia nodded, her chest tight with emotion. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." He smiled. "Thank you. You've reminded me that even when people make mistakes, they can still change." Amber shifted in her seat, her expression uncharacteristically soft. "I'm sorry for how I've been," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "To you and to Mia." Mia looked at her, surprised but grateful. "It's okay," she said. "I'm sorry too. For everything." Jay leaned back, a grin spreading across his face. "Well, since everyone's getting mushy, I guess I'll apologize too. Sorry for being me." They all laughed, the tension dissolving into something lighter, something whole. As they left the library that night, Mia felt a deep sense of peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Amber walked beside her, their shoulders brushing, while Jay joked about how he'd managed to do the least work and still get credit for the fundraiser's success. Mia glanced back at the library's warm glow and thought of Mr. Jameson, his quiet strength, and the lessons he had taught them. She knew she would carry those lessons with her, not just as memories, but as a guide for the person she wanted to become. As Mia, Amber, and Jay walked away from the library that night, they left behind more than just the bookshelves and reading circles. They left behind anger, assumptions, and old habits. In their place, they carried forward lessons of forgiveness, understanding, and growth. What about you? If you were in Mia's shoes, how would you have handled things differently? Do you think Mr. Jameson's quiet strength was the key to their transformation? And what do you believe is the most important lesson from this story? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What stood out to you? What would you have done? And if this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Elderly Wisdom for more stories that inspire empathy, challenge perspectives, and remind us of the power of second chances. Let's keep these conversations going, because every story has the power to change someone's life.